Okay, welcome to a meeting on groundwater in the South Y area. Thanks for coming, and thank you for the city of South Lake Tahoe for letting us use their meeting room and hosting. And this meeting is put on jointly by the South Tahoe Public Utility District, the Lukens Brothers Water Company, and the Tahoe Keys Water Company. And my name is Richard Solbrig. I'm the general manager at the utility district. So just quickly, our agenda for tonight, we'll do the introductions of the technical panel. We'll describe the current situation and the last couple of meetings we've had. We'll touch on the water supplier's most recent request of the state of California for assistance. And the Lahontan Regional Water Quality Control Board staff will give an update on their process and their accomplishments. And then we'll accept we have cards going around, then we'll break to take your questions and try to answer them. On that first portion of the meeting, we'll take a break, then we'll come back and we'll talk about the grant-funded feasibility study that the water agencies are running with the assistance of funding from the state of California, what's been happening in that process, and the next steps for that feasibility study. And then again, we'll take questions and answers on that second portion on the feasibility study, and then before we adjourn. So, as I said, my name is Richard Solbrig, General Manager at the Utility District. We have Sharon Katula, the Assistant General Manager here, Jennifer Lukens, the Assistant Manager at the Lukens Water Company, Rick Robillard, the Manager of the Tahoe Keys Water Company, Ivo Bergsons, the District's hydrogeologist. He's here. Scott Ferguson, the Supervising Engineer from the State Water Board's local Lahontan office is here, as well as Sashi Itagaki, who is the Principal Engineer with Kennedy Jenks. They are doing the feasibility study that the second half of the meeting will be discussed. So, where are we? We're in South Lake Tahoe, but our current situation is that, you can see on the drawing, we have a groundwater contamination issue of PCE, which covers approximately 400 acres in South Lake Tahoe. On that drawing, you see the circle at the bottom is the South Y area. That's the point of origin, the expected or anticipated point of origin for when all of the identification of the sources are done. And that's where some wells have been affected. And the plume is flowing northeast towards the lake in general. The green area is the Lukens Water Company. The purple area is the Tahoe Keys Water Company. And that their service areas. So this plume has impaired both private and public water systems and wells to the tune of almost 3.25 million gallons a day, which is about, you could service about 5,000 households. So it's a significant impact to the water supply in South Tahoe. And remember that the water agencies in South Tahoe utilize groundwater exclusively for their source of water. So that's why it's a big impact. The PC concentration, the maximum concentration so far found in the groundwater is over 1,000 parts per billion. Compare that to the safe drinking water standard is 5 parts per billion. So it's much higher than that. But let me interject here that based upon treatment efforts and the cooperation between the three water companies in terms of servicing the area, in terms of interties and helping each other supply water, the water you're drinking out of any of those water companies, the district, the Lukens, or the Tahoe Keys, is meeting drinking water standards. You're not drinking PCE contaminated water. So be relaxed about that. Now this is the third meeting we've had on this topic. The first meeting this year, the first meeting was in anticipation of the start of field work for the feasibility study. So we had a meeting, we talked about PCE, what it was, the history of its detection in South Tahoe, and the investigations and efforts that the three water companies were making at the time to deal with the PCE issue. And we had a second meeting at the conclusion of the field work where we were able to share the initial test results that were found. And then the Lahontan staff gave a detailed discussion of the processes and the efforts they were making to identify the sources and to deal with the contamination and containment of the plume. And then Ivo Bergson, our hydrogeologist, gave us all a lesson in hydrogeology and while he described the soils that are in this area are a combination of gravel, sand, silts, and clays. They all have different properties and particularly different percolation rates for groundwater. So they have made the feasibility study challenging in that they're not uniform through the area, they're discontinuous, and so the challenge is one, to find the PCE, and then once you find it, what's the best way of removing it, of pumping it, of treating it? So the soil, nature of the soil has made the feasibility study very challenging. So here we are, ready to provide you the update, the next update on the study, and we will be continuing to hold approximately quarterly meetings, public meetings, to keep you abreast of the progress on the feasibility study and the other efforts we're making. So with that, without further ado, I'll turn the microphone over to Shannon.
Thank you, Richard. As Richard said, I'm Shannon Katula, the Assistant General Manager at the South Tahoe Public Utility District. Let me see if I can figure out how to advance the slide, do it the other direction. Throughout this process, of course, we've been looking at PCE and the groundwater, and we've also been looking at the impacts to our water supply that this PCE contamination has had. And this map for us is really put things in contrast and really allowed us to focus on some issues. This map in particular reflects that 72% of our community's water supply is in proximity to or surrounds where this plume of PCE contamination is. That, of course, gives us some concern. And we recognized from the situation that we need to take action beyond what the feasibility that's been, feasibility study that we're in the midst of, as well as the Lahontan's, the Water Board's efforts to do some working with the RP, et cetera, that we needed to take some additional actions. And so we also identified that those actions should not be, those costs really shouldn't be borne by the community of South Lake Tahoe, because this was not our contamination. We didn't generate this. So we put together a program or a proposal that identified several steps that we would like to take, and we've taken this to Lahontan and folks at the state asking for assistance with these measures. The first one you'll see on here is the multi-agency emergency response plan. Typically, emergency response plans are agency-specific, but because this contamination is multi-agency and has a pretty significant potential for multi-agency impact, we felt it was necessary for our community to look at this on a broader approach than we would normally do. And unfortunately, the state has come back and is unwilling to pay for that multi-agency emergency action plan. We, however, the agencies, we see the need for this and the importance of it for our community, and so we're working together to put this together with our in-house resources to hopefully minimize the cost in putting that plan together. So we're taking action internally to address this emergency action plan. We also were requesting funding for Sentinel wells, and if you look back at this map, you'll see where the plume is. There are wells that are outside of the contamination plume, and we want to know if contamination is approaching those wells. And so we're looking to have Sentinel wells installed between those uncontaminated wells and the plume, so that if PCE contamination is moving in that direction, we have an early warning signal, if you will, that is happening, so that we can take action to protect those other water supplies. We've also requested that Tahoe Keys well number 1, that piping modifications be funded so that granulated activated carbon treatment can easily be connected to that well. Again, we don't believe that that's a cost that this community should be bearing. We've also requested funding for zone testing in Tahoe Keys well number 2 to determine the extent of contamination in that well. That well currently has carbon treatment on it, but it is we have not, and it's not easily done to break down exactly what elevation in the groundwater column that contamination exists at. As it's sucked out, it all gets mixed together as it's coming out of the pipe. So we'd really like to know, is that at 50 feet? Is it 150 feet? Is it someplace else in the water column that contamination is currently occurring? That's something we would like to have funded, again, not at the cost of our community. We also have, there are 2 wells that the Lukens Brothers water system has that have been closed down because of the contamination. Lukens Brothers well number 2 and number 3, and number 4 rather, those need to be abandoned. There obviously is a cost to abandon a municipal water supply well. It's a pretty extensive effort. We've estimated the cost of abandoning those wells at $100,000. And we're also asking for funding for Lukens well number 5, reestablishing that well, so we'll have water supply, reestablishing water supply to the Lukens Brothers Water Company, so that we'll have water within that community. So these are a bunch of efforts that we have gone to the state board and to the Lahontan board, mostly the Lahontan board, to request that funding. And Scott Ferguson's going to come up and talk about some of their actions. And we have prioritized all of these steps about what we think needs to be funded first, and they've been very receptive to working with us to try and incorporate our needs into their plans and the projects that they're working on. So, and with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Scott Ferguson to talk about what the folks at Lahontan are doing.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Ferguson. I'm a supervising water resource control engineer, division manager with the Lahontan Water Quality Control Board. And we're a state water quality protection agency with the state of California, one of 9 regional boards. Cover basically most of the eastern side of California, from the Sierra Crest over to the Nevada state line, Oregon border, down into Southern California, the Mojave Desert. Unfortunately, technical difficulties, my slides are not available, but I just have a quick, about 5-minute update to bring you up to speed on what progress has been made since I stood before you back in August. And I'm going to talk about what's been going on with the responsible parties, Lake Tahoe Laundry Works investigation, and talk about what the water boards, the progress we're making on a couple of our efforts to attack this contamination that's been described so far, and then a little bit about the coordination and providing the public with information. So just a real brief background, former Lake Tahoe Laundry Works facility used to have a dry cleaning operation and has been identified as a source of PCE contamination in the South Y area. And in response to that, our water board issued a cleanup abatement order that required them to continue operating their treatment system for on-site treatment, in addition to conducting an investigation that was to find the extent, both going out laterally and going down vertically, the extent of their contamination originating from their site. Earlier this summer, we approved a work plan, and most of this October, we have finally started seeing field investigative work with looking at soils, groundwater over in the South Y area, and we've been continuing to meet with them, and we see this as being the first few steps out. We're going to see if we can get some additional investigative work done here before the snow flies, and then look at continuing and making significant progress on that front through next year, 2019. In addition to that, the water board, Lahontan Water Board, has its own efforts underway. We are looking at We have an effort underway where we're going to be evaluating the other possible sources and responsible agencies or responsible parties. And that's going to be done on a couple of fronts, and we anticipate that being launched here probably within the next month or so. And then we are also looking at doing a very extensive evaluation of the entire PCE contamination in the South Y area. To date, there have been multiple investigations. Some have been very site-specific. Some have also been a little broader geographically, but still not, there's never been a single snapshot of the entire contamination looking outward and looking downward. And this will provide valuable information for us, both from understanding what water supply wells, we know which ones have been impacted so far, but which ones continue to be threatened. We're looking at, Shannon talked about how there is coordination between the water board and the water districts. We're looking to see how we can use our investigative funding and activities to help meet some of the district's needs here. So there was a mention of sentinel wells. We've written our scope of work in a way that we believe will allow us to do some of that work. Some of the work discussions about looking at depth discrete around the some of the existing wells to see just at what level is this contamination coming into these wells. We have an opportunity, and we're evaluating the possibility for us to use our state funds to help the districts out for that also. Those are a couple of examples of the coordination that's going on between the state of California here locally, and then with our parent agency. You'll probably hear about some of the funding efforts that are going on to help out, say, Lucan's Brothers Water District and help this community in general. I just wanted to step back one other thing, going back to the responsible parties with Laundry Works. A few things to look forward to in addition to us hoping to get a little more investigative work done. The first major report that's been produced in quite a while will be forthcoming this spring, March, April time period. And our enforcement action, our cleanup and abatement order does require them to report out on every 6 months now that they've started investigative work. And that'll be something that I'm anticipating will hopefully set us up for making real significant progress next in 2019 and having them fully examine the lateral and vertical extent of their contamination. So our look into additional sources, I said that we're hoping to get that going full bore here in late part of 2018. We're looking to kick off our field investigation in early to mid 2019 and make significant progress throughout the summer months and try and get as much information, again, to feed into how can we tackle this thing and continue to provide safe drinking water to the community. We're going to continue coordinating with the districts, water districts, and also, as I've discussed, you've heard a couple of examples of how we're trying to provide some of that support, financial support for the districts in our efforts to also examine the extent of the contamination. Looking forward, we're looking at increased coordination among the water districts, the responsible parties, the state. We're also, I think Richard was the one that talked about quarterly public meetings. We will continue to participate with those, keeping the public informed of how we're progressing. You'll also see press releases when we get ready to start doing our field investigative work to let you know that that's going forward. We'll see about our website, be updating that. So there will be multiple ways to keep in touch when you don't see us before you, like tonight, to keep monitoring the progress that the state, water districts, and responsible parties are all making on this effort. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. So we have have a few minutes scheduled for questions and answers because after this, we're going to dive into the feasibility study, looking at ways to clean up the contaminant plume. So before we do that, if you want to write down any questions that you have for Lucan's Brother Water Company, Tahoe Keys Water Company, South Tahoe Public Utility District, or Lahontan Regional Planning Agency, you can write them down now, and I'll take them now. They're not going anywhere. They're going to be here. But this is just an opportunity to ask questions at this point before we dive into the more technical details of the feasibility study. So I'll walk around with a basket if anyone has questions, and we can address them now and then go from there. Does that sound good?
Take a question from those guys. Our staff.
Share with someone else.
I think it's got to keep it okay. So before you talk, just don't forget to press that button.
I might forget.
I can stand up there and ask him to be really, stirred voice.
You guys are down there like they were broke. We turned it to doing some work on his house.
Oh, so you didn't have a shovel down.
It's just kind of funny. I forget who it was a while ago, but I was like, really?
Okay, so maybe,
Definitely don't take any.
Are we ready?
yeah, Scott, before you talk, just make sure that you turn on your mic, and we'll get you started, and the other folks have more.
Okay, I received 4 of the cards. So the first card is, are there any updates on the legally responsible parties sampling and monitoring efforts? Is it available for the public to view? If so, where can it be found? And how is it being shared? Okay. The latest effort on the responsible party sampling is that they've done this past month. They've been sampling groundwater and soil behind the Big O, the former Big O tire facility on Tucker Avenue. That's where they've stepped out. They've done, previous to that, they did some sampling and groundwater and soil sampling in Lake Tahoe Boulevard. So they're looking at that information. They're also doing some evaluation right now of current groundwater flow direction. And so that's where they stand right now. So they have not moved very far out away from their location, but that is the cleanup and abatement order that we issued is intended to have them keep stepping out until they find the extent of their the leading edge of their contamination. Their reports are all available, I believe, and I'm gonna look to some of my staff back there. Can it be viewed publicly through GeoTracker? Yes. So you can go to our website and find access to the reports that are being produced, whether it's us or it's also you can find a lot of the correspondence that's going on, whether it's produced by us or by the responsible parties. And so that's it, and that's at the easiest way without writing it up would be at www.waterboards.ca.gov, and you're looking for the Lahontan Water Board's webpage. So that's primarily how it's being how it's available and being shared. Yes, Brian?
Just to clarify, the documents are actually available on the GeoTracker website, not the Water Board website. So just to be aware of that. So look for the GeoTracker website. You can do a Google search, or it's actually geotracker.waterboards.ca.gov as well.
So,
Will you repeat that into the mic?
no. So what Brian Graves, who was speaking from the audience, he's one of the Lahontan Water Board staff, and he was saying that the information is being available on the GeoTracker website, and the address to that is GeoTracker. Just Google for it, and then you'd be able to find it, and then type in Lake Tahoe Laundry Works. Is that the best way to go? So that's how to go about that. Yeah. That's the first card. As Lake Tahoe Laundry Works stayed in compliance with the cleanup and abatement order? Yes, I'd say we have not issued any notices of violation or anything. It did take quite a while to get an acceptable work plan in place. But that went through the typical process of how it sometimes works with our cleanup and abatement orders, where we'll require a work plan to be developed, whether it's a cleanup site or it's a mitigation site or something, and they don't always hit it right the first time, and usually there's some back and forth until we get it into shape. That's the process that we went through on this one, and that's what's led to them implementing it. They have been following their work plan as they described it, and we keep meeting with them to keep this moving forward and keep them into compliance with the cleanup and abatement order. When will Lahontan field investigations be completed? When will State Water Board funding decisions be, I'm not sure. Oh, awarded? Announced? Let's start with the first one. We are hoping that we can get our field investigation rolling, and if the stars align, I'm hopeful that we might be able to get it done in one season. It's more than likely it'll take 2 years. So 2019, finish up in 2020. And when will State Water Board funding decisions be announced? We're hoping 2-3 months here. And it will definitely be a press release when that does happen, describing in greater detail what the funding is, what it's intended to cover, and provide you guys that kind of information, the public that kind of information. Who are the other responsible parties being required to investigate groundwater? Have they been contacted? Will orders be issued? When? Okay, we have not, you heard me say we're about to get our effort on other potential sources really underway in about the next month or so. That will be the initial outreach. There's another element of our investigation where we do plan on probably requiring some more investigative work, and that'll be rolling out here as part of this effort that I described. And so that's the timing. And will it be done under orders? We'll see how it works out on the mechanism for making that happen. And the cards keep rolling in. How about this one?
1,000 ppm.
Yeah.
Just ppm.
Does it affect taste?
At 1,000 ppm.
Yeah.
I don't know that I know the
I
answer
don't
to
know.
that.
Okay. Me neither. First question on this card, does PCE affect taste at 1,000 parts per million what do you put in, and then in parentheses, chemicals to fix taste? I don't know. On the first part, what I can tell you is that your drinking water supply is not seeing anything. The public drinking water supply that's provided by the water purveyors up here, they are meeting water quality, maximum contaminant level requirements, water quality standards. So your water continues to be safe. And and they're just, in some cases, it does have wellhead treatment. You heard granulated activated carbon being mentioned. In other cases, it's coming from wells that are not affected. How long will it take take the plume to get to TKPOA wells? Well, it's actually already affecting 2 out of 3 wells. One of the Tahoe Keys wells does have a granulated activated carbon wellhead treatment system. The other one does have PCE levels, but they are under the water quality standard. They're below that, they're meeting the standard. And then the third well has not been affected. And then that, you heard like Sentinel wells mentioned. That would be kind of one of the purposes of Sentinel wells, is to get a better idea if there is contamination, and then you can have a better idea of how that, to determine what kind of threat it does present to the wells that are not being contaminated, or that are not contaminated. Are gas stations a source of PCE? Typical sources of PCE are industries that use solvents. So it's not linked to gasoline like MTBE was. It was MTBE was a fuel additive. But dry cleaners have been a traditional source also of PCE, again, solvents. So automotive repairs, body work type things, shops, those are some of the others. People are using solvents.
Real quick, I just wanted to piggyback on the question about taste and odor in your water. If you have a taste or odor problem at your home, I would recommend you reach out to your specific water system so that we could investigate it. If you're talking about like a chlorine smell, I know that all 3 of the water systems do disinfect using chlorination. So if that's a concern, again, reach out to your specific water system.
Final card, have other communities experienced similar PCE contamination? Are there any thoughts on how long this cleanup may take? Yes, other communities do have PCE contamination, as I said, like dry cleaners, automotive repair, other industries that use solvents containing PCE have resulted in groundwater contamination throughout multiple communities in the state and elsewhere. Are there any thoughts on how long this cleanup may take? I don't have any estimate at this time. PCE is a tough contaminant to take care of in that its properties, it does like to absorb to soil, but then it can be released back into the groundwater. That's part of it. And so getting it out can be challenging. That's part of what the feasibility study is. That's an element of it, looking at what are our options, what are some of the best options, and we'll hear some more about that on how to tackle the cleanup and how to go about continuing to provide safe drinking water. And that's all I have.
With the question as far as with getting back to the question that went to Scott, I think the person was asking probably looking at, instead of 1,000 parts per million, I think they were probably meant 1,000 parts per billion, what was on the screen. So the solubility of PCE as far as in groundwater itself is like 200 milligrams per liter. So if you had concentrations over 200 milligrams per liter, it would be coming out as what they refer to as a dense aqueous phase liquid. So it would partition out of the water as a separate phase. So you would definitely have a problem if you saw that in your tap at those concentrations. But again, the high concentrations that you saw on the screen were on 1,000 parts per billion. So that's equivalent to like 1 part per million. So again, it's even at 1,000 parts per billion, which I'm not trying to downplay by any means, is very much different than if you're an order of magnitude greater than that if you're talking about parts per million versus parts per billion. With the questions that, so the question that I have on the card, there are several questions here. With district supply, it says, was chlorine amount in our water supply at the Y? The district, we have to disinfect our water before it enters our water distribution system. We add very low levels of chlorine. It's typically at the state requirement as far as our residual. We measure the amount of chlorine residual. The state requirement is about 0.2 milligrams per liter. If you want to get exact numbers, we test that on a monthly basis. And if you contact myself, again, my name is Ivo Bergson, or you can contact the district lab directly. Dan Arce is our lab director, and we'd be happy to provide you with those numbers.
Ivo, I'm also going to leave some of my cards up here at the table, so feel free to contact me. And if you've got questions about your area, what your chlorine levels are, feel free to give us a call, and we'll get you the information.
So the next question on that builds on the first question. It says PCE and chlorine mixing as to byproducts. That's a very interesting question. I do not know, or I'm not familiar with any disinfection byproducts due to the mixing of PCE and chlorine. Typically, disinfection byproducts that are regulated by the state and by the federal government have to do with organic matter and how they interact with chlorine. And again, we're sourced primarily, well, more than 90% of our drinking water supply in the South Shore area is from groundwater, and so you don't have an issue with organics. That's typically for surface water reservoirs where you have disinfection byproduct problems. So that has not been an issue for any of the water suppliers up here in the South Shore area. I think probably the best answer with the PCE and chlorine mixing, to my knowledge, the district is not providing any water in our distribution systems from PCE contaminated wells. So there is no source of PCE to mix with the chlorine to create any kind of potential byproducts, again, which I'm not certain there are any. Question about Sentinel wells, $100,000 a well, does that include monitoring costs? No, it doesn't. That would just include the drilling and construction cost of the monitoring well or of the Sentinel well. Last question, Lucan Brothers. The request, the water suppliers request the $2 million cost. They're looking for a little bit more detail on that. Shannon or Jennifer, if you want to address that.
The $2 million cost that Lukens is requesting is for wellhead treatment at well number 5, which is one of the contaminated wells on 12th Street. It would provide granulated activated carbon filtration at the well site to treat 750 gallons per minute which would allow for Lukens to close the intertie with South Tahoe Public Utility District. We currently are working through the state revolving fund process for state revolving funds for that. The last update I had a week ago was that the project was getting their the environmental clearances, the technical clearances, and the financial clearances before they started writing the funding agreement. So we've really been working diligently with Lahontan Regional Board, the other water systems, in order to secure grant funding to minimize costs to our customers on that.
Just repeat the treatment again, how much water you're able to treat?
Sure, it's 750 GPM, which is not the full capacity of the well, but it is part of the capacity of that well.
Was that all the questions that were written, team? Did you get to the bottom of your list, Eva?
Good evening. My name is Sachi Itagaki. I'm with Kennedy Jenks Consultants, and I'm really happy to be here to talk a little bit about the South Y feasibility study. I started my career here in Lake Tahoe quite a while ago. It's nice to see some friendly faces out there. The purpose of the feasibility study is to evaluate the feasibility of pumping or treatment of groundwater upstream to reduce the contamination of the drinking water wells downstream. There are three main elements to the feasibility study. The public outreach, this is the third meeting. The prior meetings were in February and in August of 2018. And so we're continuing this public outreach as mentioned earlier. The second element was the pre-design investigation. This is the field work that Evo talked to back in the August meeting. I'll summarize some of the data and some of the outcomes of that. And then there's the feasibility study itself. We prepared a feasibility study work plan, which we reviewed with the State Water Resources Control Board, which is the funding agency under Proposition 1. And it has a number of steps, 8 main steps. It includes first the data review, some of which we've talked about and I'll review again today. The second step is really to refine and screen the different alternatives using the groundwater model in order to embark on a more of a technical engineering evaluation. This is where we're at right now, and we're taking advantage of groundwater model that has been in a process and being worked on for quite a while now. The next step after we're done with the kind of the development of the alternatives is to actually define some infrastructure needs for each of the alternatives. That would be the kinds of treatment and wells and pumping facilities, pipelines, maybe storage that might be required to actually fully implement an alternative. From the definition of the infrastructure needs, then we can actually develop life cycle cost estimates. So that would be both capital, which includes kind of planning and permitting, as well as design and construction, through operations. And the groundwater model will help us at least inform how long we think we might need to operate the different facilities for in order to achieve the outcomes that we're envisioning. Once we've defined the project and have an idea of what's involved in each element of the construction and such, we'll prepare an initial study checklist, which includes the California Environmental Quality Act, the CEQA initial study checklist. And if there's any mitigation involved, such as construction-related noise or perhaps air quality-related issues, of course, water quality from erosion and sedimentation from construction, all those might require some mitigation, and we'll estimate a cost for that. The next step will be to really develop and fully, define better the recommended alternative. And that will be based on a number of different factors. Then we'll look at developing an implementation plan for that recommended alternative, both from a financial perspective, which could include applying for the next step of funding under Proposition 1 for implementation, construction, as well as governance. There's a number of water agencies involved and other parties, and so how might the actual project get implemented, particularly over the long term, who's going to cover the costs of things like operations and maintenance. That will be discussed. And we'll document the findings in a draft and final report. So the next couple slides are part of the data review. Some of these were shared in August, maybe in a little bit of a different form. And first, we're going to talk about the PCE concentrations in the relatively shallower zone, the 0 to 60 feet below ground surface. If you might remember from the last time, it was mentioned that this is a layered groundwater system. So there is a shallower zone, and then there's deeper zones, which are really where the water for the drinking water supply comes from. So recognize that there's some separation, and there are some actual physical barriers in parts of the aquifer as well. So in this shallower area, we took the results from the last several sampling events from 2016 to 2018, and we took the highest values in these shallow zones within the study area. You'll see the South Y area here, and then you'll see to the lower kind of middle, that's the Lake Tahoe Laundry Works area. That's the source area, where they have been actually continuing remediation of the shallow soils with something called the soil vapor extraction system. Essentially draws a vacuum on the soils and sucks out the PCE in more of a vapor form so that it can't get migrated down into the groundwater. Well, what the data are telling us is this area, which has kind of the darker red dots, is that there are still some high concentrations of PCE in the groundwater remaining. And this happens primarily because the PCE is tied to some tighter soil particles, and that could even be down gradient of the original source, and they could leach out over time. So even though they're working on the up gradient area where the primary discharge occurred, over time, both the PCE and both the groundwater and in the soils may have migrated. And of course, what we're seeing is the PCE actually present in the groundwater. The concentrations range from less than 0.5 part per billion or microgram per liter, which is the detection limit for PCE out here in these kind of upper left-hand area down Highway 89, up to over 1,000 parts per billion here kind of in the middle of the graphic with the dark red dots. So the high concentrations are relatively in a small area. There's some recent data that were just collected in October that indicate that there may be 1,000 parts per billion greater kind of over here just across the street from the Lake Tahoe Laundry Works site. That said, I know 1,000 and 1,300 parts per billion may sound like a lot, but from a treatment perspective, that's actually relatively dilute, especially since the areas of high concentration are relatively small, and they are above the drinking water standard of 5 parts per billion. But when it comes to treatment, the dilute nature of the PCE means that you pump a lot of groundwater to remove a relatively modest level of PCE. As I mentioned on the next slide, the data are presented for some of the deeper layers of the groundwater. Could be about 120 feet or greater. This is where the drinking water is drawn from 120 feet and depending on the well, even deeper than that, often much deeper than that, which is could be potentially an advantage. So these data are showing to the far left the Tahoe Keys Well 3 to the north and Lucan's Brother Well 1 a little bit to the south in the green. Those are at non-detect, less than 0.5 parts per billion of PCE. So those are clean and those are the primary sources of supply. Within the black dotted line, those are where there might be some higher detectable concentrations. Up north at Tahoe Keys Well 1, there's about 2.4 parts per billion, which is under the drinking water standard. I believe that's more of a backup supply. More in the middle, there's the Tahoe Keys Well 2, which is at 24 parts per billion. That has a granular activated carbon, a GAC treatment unit that will remove the PCE so that the drinking water that's actually delivered meets the drinking water standard. To the south of that is the Lukens Brother Well 5 area. That's a well that's not currently being used for drinking water, but Luken Brothers is currently planning a GAC treatment unit for that as well. I'm waiting for state funding on that, as was mentioned earlier. Moving south in the deeper aquifer, there's still some somewhat lower concentrations, 3.4 to 14 parts per billion over there at the MW7 site, just to the south of the Lukens Brother 4. And then some non-detects as you go even further south in the deeper aquifer, which is good news. The 64 parts actually that you're seeing at the Monorail 4B is actually at about 35 to 50 feet, so it's actually even a little bit shallower. So as you go deeper, it seems like it's somewhat lower. So this information actually really does set the stage for the groundwater model, which I'll talk about in the next couple slides, by the Desert Research Institute. Know also that there are some what's called aquatards, or more clay layers, which prevent migration of contaminants and of the water itself between the shallower and deeper zones in some portions of this area. So there's not enough data actually to know how extensive the aquatard division is. So moving on to the next slide about the groundwater model. Realize that a groundwater model is a mathematical representation of the groundwater system. So it's a tool to be able to estimate what might happen, particularly into the future. It's a tool that we're using to really screen and refine the alternatives. So this is a plan view, or kind of from the top view of the groundwater model. If you look carefully, you'll see the Tahoe Keys up there to the north. And so the original groundwater model was a calibrated model, but it was regional. It was a much bigger area. And it's now been downscaled for the purpose of our study to more or less the red area. And they have increased the grid density in this area to be able to hopefully improve some of the resolution and detail in that area. So in the South White area, you'll see it's a little bit darker. That means the grid's denser. It's about 100 feet by 100 feet per grid cell. So that's how it is in the model in the plan view. On the next slide, I show how the model represents the various layers. So to the right are the 4 layers that are modeled. The L1, which is 0 to 120 feet. That's where most of the contamination still occurs. And the layer 2, that's about 120 to 240 feet below ground surface. And what you'll see to the immediate left is just a representation of the Tahoe Keys Well 2, for example, and then Luken Brother Well 4. So both of these wells are screened in 1 or 2 of the top layers. In the case of Luken's Brother 4, it's both the top layer 1 and layer 2. Luken's Brother Well number 2 is screened, which is where it's drawing the water from, in the layer 2, and in the layer 3, which is the deeper zone, from 240 to 540 feet below ground surface. And the very deepest layer 4, from 540 to about 840 feet below ground surface, that's actually not really where there's much water available for pumping. And so, as Richard mentioned, the Tahoe Keys Well 2, actually I guess it was Shannon mentioned, that they're looking to try to discern, by doing some vertical sampling in this well 2, whether the contamination is coming from the shallower area or the deeper area. So one reason I wanted to show this 4-layer system and how the model is representing the groundwater system is that it does simplify or average what is actually somewhat complex hydrogeology. And in fact, between the 0 and 120 feet, there are also some smaller aquatards or clay layers that separate. So depending on where you are, like near our EW1 well site, there was actually encountered some smaller, shallower, 2 and 3 feet deep aquatards. So the other thing I wanted to mention is that within layer one grid cell of the model is about 100 feet by 100 feet by 120 feet deep. So that represents about 110,000 gallons of water. So there's going to be a lot of averaging that happens just because there's a lot of water represented. And as you might have noticed, that the shallower aquifer, which is half of the first layer, is about where most of the contamination occurs. So next slide talks about how we use the model to refine the alternatives. So it's a good tool, and we want to take it the most advantage of it. But in order to do that, we really do need to understand what it's telling us. So the purpose of the model is to give us an idea of the generalized movement of PCE within these groundwater layers into the future. So the model goes back in the past and tries to emulate what has happened in the past given the data that we have, and then we can use that to look at some what-if scenarios with various alternatives into the future. So right now, some of the current activities that DRI is working on, that we're working with them as a team on, is to refine the model using the results of the PDI investigation and other new field data that I just presented. We're developing some model scenarios to bookend the range of alternatives to try to understand some of these what-ifs, and I'll talk about some of these alternatives. And then we're going to evaluate some of the selected alternatives that we've developed through the modeling for treatment and disposal. As mentioned, we pump a lot of water to try to find that optimum point of dollars spent and against the benefits, which is really the amount of PC that's removed up gradient. And so when we model these alternatives and do the screening and refinement, we're really trying to focus resources to define the kind of an optimized alternative. And based on that, and we will be able to be limiting our effort on doing the engineering, the technical engineering, the cost estimating, with a better idea of kind of the benefit of an individual alternative. So we can tell you, well, if you're going to spend this much money, that we would expect, using the model, that we're going to have this kind of PCE removal. So what is that range of alternatives? Well, the next slide talks about what we think is the current range of alternatives we're thinking of. So there's three major flavors, as it were, of alternatives. One is to really just replace the wells into the deeper zone, that layer 3, and avoid groundwater treatment altogether. Of course, we'd have to confirm with some other sampling and such that those deeper zones indeed are clean. But if you look at the Tahoe Keys Well 3 and the Lukens Brother Well 1, those are deeper zones, they're out of the plume area, and that's certainly one approach to meeting the needs of the water suppliers. The next kind of alternative is to pump the wells to really capture the plume and intercept the plume before it gets to some of these production wells. Those would require groundwater treatment, which obviously has some expense associated with it. And as I mentioned earlier, because the PCE concentrations are relatively dilute, at least from a treatment perspective, we do pump a lot of water for a relatively modest PCE removal. But we're going to be able to use the model to try to help us estimate how much and for how long do we need to pump and those kinds of things. The third kind of alternative is an in situ or in place treatment or remediation. And we would be looking to use those in areas of those highest PCE concentrations. And so this is actually an area which may not be that great to model. I mentioned that averaging that occurs. So, so the model may not be the best tool to understand the benefit of it. But I think it stands to reason that if there is a high concentration as evidenced by the field data, then that's something that we might want to recommend that, some kind of remediation occur. So one thing I did want to point out is when we talk about this plume capture and interception, we did some of that field work, the PDI that Ivo mentioned the last time. And what we estimate that at the 40 gallons per minute pumping rate that, that relatively small test well can pump out, that, the extraction from a pounds per day perspective is going to be 0.03 pounds per day at 40 GPM, gallons per minute, which is about, a half an ounce per day of PCE. And recognizing that as, time goes on, we're expecting that the mass to go down and the concentrations to go down, so you're pumping more and more water relative to the amount of PCE that you're capturing. So in terms of looking at these individual alternatives a little bit closer, we'll go to the next slide, which talks about some of the potential well locations that we could consider. These are where we want to start targeting some of our groundwater modeling work and our engineering analysis as well. This map that you showed here shows a couple things. It shows the outline of the PCE contamination. To the north, those red parcels, those are areas that are owned by the Tahoe Keys Property Owners Association. So we think those are some good candidate sites for some infrastructure. And then some of the other color coding is parcels owned by Lukens Brothers, which is blue. So Lukens Brother Well 4 site, that's about an acre. That's actually a nice candidate site, or the Lukens Brother Well 3 site down to the south. And then the green areas, there's a large rectangular area, which is a school, which is owned by the Lake Tahoe Unified School District. Some of the other kinds of lands are the blue federal lands over here, the pinkish state lands. I do believe those are conservancy properties. And so we worked with the water agencies to try to understand, where they thought some good candidate sites are, so that we can have that be part of the modeling exercise. So one other consideration for us is how big the parcel is, because, these facilities aren't necessarily small. A well, for example, just a well and a pump house and the electrical could be, in the order of 100 feet by 100 feet. Treatment, of course, would be bigger than that. It may require storage as well, water storage and pumping facilities as well. You might find that you need pipelines, which may be kind of 8 to 10 feet of, width, especially during construction. And we're finding we might be operating these facilities for 20 or even 30 years or even longer. And that's what we're hoping to use the model to help us understand as well. And then that model really help us get to kind of an order of magnitude time estimate, so we understand how much do we need to operate these facilities. So the replacement well sites, and these well sites are a function of some conversations and information we got from the various water agencies. So on the left-hand area, there's the RWA, the replacement well A site. That was one close to where Tahoe Keys suggested. The replacement well B site's kind of more in the middle, and it's in an area where there might be a little bit of PCE. We're not quite sure. Maybe if you go deeper, that might not be the case. And then the replacement well C site over here off by the meadow as well. The replacement well D site here, just a little south, is near the Colorado Court area, and the district actually did a test boring not too far away from there as a possible replacement well site. So we have some good information on that one. The replacement well E site is down here, just off of Keys Boulevard. That's a parcel that may be locally owned. And then we have the replacement well E site to the far left. That's just to the south side of Highway 89, and that could be, possible site maybe for a Lukens Brother well. We are aware of the Lukens Brother 4 well site. That's actually about a 1 acre parcel, so that actually has some nice possibilities. It's also, fairly in an area of fairly high concentration as well. And that could be either a shallow well, if it were to be more of that plume containment kind of approach, or it could be a deeper well if it's trying to avoid the contamination altogether. Also did want to point out this Lucan Brothers Well 3 site, just because it is in an area of relatively high concentration. So there, it's a property that's owned by one of the partners. So these are the well locations that are kind of candidate sites that are going to be part of some combination, whether singularly or in combination with the existing wells, as part of the modeling exercise. So what are the next steps of the feasibility study? We're starting to wrap this up. We expect the groundwater modeling to continue. We're hoping to wrap it up by January and to be able to complete runs for these alternative simulations, including these replacement wells, this mid-plume containment removal, as well as some discussions perhaps around in-situ treatment if appropriate. The feasibility study we hope to be, well complete by within that early, kind of the March 2019 timeframe. We'll be selecting up to 3 alternatives for life cycle costing. We'll be defining those facility needs and estimating the cost for implementation and preparing the implementation cost plan that we talked about.
So